Today we are looking at one of the jewels of the collection. This is a coat made of satin embroidered in silk, and we date it to the 1610s. Garments that predate the 18th century are very rare. We believe it was made at the Mughal court itself, which makes it extraordinarily rare as a survivor of the Great Mughal period. The Mughals were the ruling power in South Asia in the 17th century, and at the time that this coat was produced, their court was among the most wealthy in the entire world, if not the wealthiest. The products that the court produced were of the highest caliber, using skills that artisans brought to the court from all over the subcontinent and beyond. I am going to be looking at it today without gloves because the fabric is very fragile and I need to be able to feel what I'm doing as I handle it. However, I have just washed my hands. This coat is extraordinary for many reasons, but one of the first and most incredible is the level of detail in this pattern. Landscape scenes like this one were popular at the Mughal court in the 1610s. Inherited from the Iranian tradition, they typically featured predators hunting their prey amongst a rich landscape of foliage and creatures. I have spent hours looking at this coat and I am still discovering new details about its design. The details are so in-depth, so minuscule, that you can even find tiny drops of blood where the lion is biting into the deer. This scene combines several different cosmopolitan influences, very reflective of the nature of the Mughal court at this period. While we have the Iranian landscape template in the animal combat scenes, we also have the influence of China as depicted through the approaches to rocky landscapes and the plum blossoms. And we have the influence of Europe as seen in the naturalistic approach to the flower designs, which is a style of design that would go on to dominate at the Mughal court for the next century. Part of what makes this coat so extraordinary is also the mystery of its origins. It was sold to the museum in the mid-20th century by a woman named Miss Beryl Blake. And at that time, it was not standard museum practice to ask more in-depth questions about how the object came into her ownership. So we can never really be certain how it is that this coat arrived in England, but we do know that in the 1610s, it was part of political protocol to offer diplomatic gifts, and this may have been one of the gifts offered to English representatives. Sleeveless coats like this one are known by many names. They are sometimes referred to as hunting coats or riding coats, and sometimes also as nadiri or rarities. We know based on Mughal painting that coats of this style, sleeveless and mid-thigh length, were popularly worn by courtiers at the court. A garment like this one, especially if it was fur-lined, and that fur would have extended in order to cover this empty portion of the satin here, would have been used as an outer garment worn over a jama or a skirted robe, and tied with a sash at the waist. And that may be why these areas on the sides have more wear than other portions of the coat, to the extent that conservation has had to support it with invisible netting. This piece is made of a very high quality satin, which may have been imported from Iran, and it's been embroidered in a very fine chain stitch, which has likely been done at the court itself within the embroidery workshop. It is not of the quality that might perhaps be worn by an emperor himself, which would usually include some elements of gold. However, the fine quality of the materials and the exceptional quality of the embroidery certainly sets it apart as a courtly garment. This coat was the product of many hands. It was not only the embroiderers who embroidered the design, it was also tailors who drafted the silhouette, and court manuscript artists who would have provided the detailed images that the embroiderers stitched. The coat has been so beautifully put together that it is hard to see the seams, but if we look at it closely, we can actually see that it has been assembled from 4 panels. In the front, we have this center panel that runs down the middle, and then you can see the seam here onto which a triangular piece has been added to create the skirt. In the same way, on the other side, we have a secondary triangular piece. And if we look at the underarm area, we can see that there is another triangular piece which forms the underarm gusset. In the past year, we made the decision to ask our textile conservation team to unpick part of the lining, which we believe is not original, in order to see underneath and into the interior of the coat. Most garments and textiles need to be able to be seen from all sides, insides and out, in order to properly understand how they were constructed. And indeed, being able to see inside the coat has already revealed a number of new things. For instance, at this panel seam here, we can see that this salmon pink stripe is running down one side. That stripe would have indicated the selvage of the satin ground from which the coat is made. The selvage is the outer edge of a length of cloth, and it gives one side to the width of the full piece of fabric. If we look through and under the lining, we can see that there is another salmon pink stripe on the other side of the central back panel of the coat, just about here. And what that tells us is that this fabric, the width of satin that fills the central back panel of the coat, is in fact a full selvage to selvage width of the satin ground. That tells us how wide the original cloth from which this coat was made actually was. And it helps us to understand why the tailors may have drafted this garment out of so many assembled panels. When we look at the coat from the front, we can see these incredibly vibrant blues and greens and yellows, but the pinks are very pale. Generally speaking, Mughal fashion called for more jewel-like reds, and so surprisingly muted pinks in this pattern made us ask questions about whether or not this coat had experienced significant light exposure and therefore significant fading. When we unpicked the lining, that allowed us to confirm to what extent light damage may have actually occurred, because the interior has never been exposed to light. So we would expect these threads to be more or less the same color that they were when they were made. When we look closely at them, what we find is that the yellows, greens, and blues are still just as bright on the interior as they are on the exterior, which suggests that it has not received as significant an amount of light damage as we were worried it may have. The pinks and oranges are also still quite pale, which is surprising, however, somewhat of a relief, because it tells us that what we're seeing on the front is not necessarily the result of exposure damage. It may instead be either that the original reds and pinks were pastel to begin with, possibly as an influence from Safavid Iran, where these kinds of shades of pinks were very popular, or else that the pinks and oranges themselves may have been dyed with a natural dye called safflower, which can give extraordinarily vibrant oranges and pinks, however, is very unstable and will degrade with age. This section, though very small, is still very bright, and that gives us an indication of what all of those reds and oranges might have been when they were new. Looking at the interior also allowed us to confirm that the embroidery was done on the individual panels before they were sewn together. We can see that by looking at this seam. We can see stitches of the embroidery caught in the sewn seam. This means that the embroidery had to be done before the panels were sewn together. In order for the embroidery to have been done before sewing it together, the embroiderers must have had a complete picture of what the final garment would look like. Embroidering the panels separately would have required extraordinary planning in order to keep these very tiny details, like butterflies and small plants, consistent from one panel to the next. The interior of the lining has revealed one further thing we didn't know previously about the coat, and that was specifically what tools were used to make it. India is renowned for its chain stitching, particularly Ari chain stitching, which is worked with a tool like this, a hooked Ari needle. The mechanism of this needle is that it is held underneath the fabric, and loops of thread are pulled up and through the fabric to create the loops in the chain. However, These petals of the daffodils not passing entirely through the cloth indicates that an ari hook could not have been used. Rather, a straight needle was used to make these stitches. To make chain stitches this fine and small with a straight needle required expert eyesight and expert hand-eye coordination. The fact that the construction of this garment was planned in advance is attested to and evidenced by its borders. Integral borders such as these made the construction of the coat that much more difficult, because while you might be able to get away with subtle variations in the matching of the pattern in the field because of just how much is going on, the lines of the border really have to match where they meet at the seams. We can see that they have successfully matched the border of the underarm gusset and the back panel here at the join. However, in order to make that possible, they had to make a last-minute adjustment when they constructed the coat. This fold here, which appears at first glance to be a seam, is in fact a tuck. The tailors have actually folded in a portion of the design where it meets the border pattern in order to create a consistent run from the back panel into the underarm. The balance that is created by mirroring the pattern on either side of the body is complemented by additional customizations to the design, which break up the effect of the repeat. We don't know if this was the work of the court embroiderers or the court artists. However, when we take a closer look at the motifs in detail, we can see how they have been subtly changed. These wildcats up here differ in their coats. We have one with the stripes of a tiger and one with the golden sheen of a lion. We find the same variation in the depiction of rabbits and herons, peacocks and deer all throughout the front side of the garment. Viewing the coat from the back gives us the opportunity to appreciate the pattern in its full form. We're faced with a burgeoning jungle full of creatures, bugs, flowers, plants. The repeat itself is only about this size. However, in order to prevent the design from becoming repetitive, the designers very cleverly flipped the design with each repeat so that your eye is not able to find any repetitions of the pattern. This work would have been done by the court artists themselves, the same people who created the Mughal court paintings. And we can see the evidence of their hands in the black line drawings where the embroiderers have neglected to cover them up. From these drawings, the embroiderers would have worked. And this too would have also been a team effort, combining both highly skilled master embroiderers and the efforts of junior embroiderers. Master embroiderers would be tasked with doing the most complicated motifs, especially the animals and the more naturalistic flowers, while the junior embroiderers would be given the smaller portions of the design, particularly the filler flowers, small pebbles, and tiny nimbus clouds. When we look closely at the forms of the animals and the plants, we can see how they manipulated the direction of the stitches in order to give a sense of movement to the figures, shifting the lines around the curves of the leg, the throat, the jaw. They also introduced subtle color variations, which gave a three-dimensionality to the figures. We can see that the lion's back is a dark brown at the top, where it might be in shadow. Over the many hours that I have spent with this coat, my favorite details are not actually the most spectacularly embroidered ones. They're the mistakes, the little bits and pieces that remind me that these were made by real people. Over here, the petal of a poppy leaf has not been filled, or the turn of a stitch has not been completed. These subtle mistakes, if we can call them mistakes, are part of what makes this garment so unique. They're fingerprints of the people who made it. Looking at this extraordinary survivor in detail gives us the opportunity to connect with the people who made it, to see the evidence of their hands in the construction and design of this piece. For over 400 years, it has survived as a testament to the skill and creativity of the artists working at the Mughal court.